Welcome to The Rippling Pages, a podcast on the craft of writing, crafted and curated by me, Liam Bishop. Now, Grace Zulu is a headstrong Zambian lawyer guided by an unwavering moral compass and sense of justice. But her perseverance and determination will be tested more than ever when she's given the case of Wilness Bessy Malenga. In the eyes of the Zambian law, Bessy has been arrested for offences against nature. What that really means is that he's been persecuted for being a homosexual in 1990s Zambia. In Iris Mwanza's debut novel, The Lion's Den, published by Canongate, when Bessy then goes missing, it launches Grace into a world of corruption on seemingly all levels of society and the justice system. This is Iris's first novel, but she has quite the resume already. She's the Deputy Director of Women in Leadership in the Gender Equality Division of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and has herself worked as a lawyer in both Zambia and the US. Iris also serves on the supervisory board of Care International and the board of directors of the World Wildlife Fund. Iris, thank you very much for joining me on the Rippling Pages.
Thanks, Liam. I'm absolutely excited and delighted to be here.
But right now you're joining me from Zambia, that's correct?
Yes, I am in Zambia right now, but my usual home is in the US.
Just to say, listeners, actually, we are recording on the morning of
We are.
The morning of, or the morning after, I should say, the election in America. So it is quite a bit of a strange, it's quite a strange feeling actually to be on the kind of edge of history, for better or for worse.
Or for worse. Yeah, it's been a stressful night. Lots of waking up and checking my phone and checking results, but I think it's not quite over yet. So, but I think in a couple of hours we will know definitively which way it's going. But it is a longer and longer shot for Kamala Harris.
Yeah, it's so just before we came on the call, Pennsylvania had been called or projected as they do in America. Well, why don't you start then by telling us about the case that's at the center of this book? Who is Wilness, and what's happened?
There are two protagonists. One is Grace, who is the lawyer, very young lawyer, very passionate. As you mentioned, she has a strong core that leads her to do the right thing. She will go to the ends of the earth for her client. That is just her DNA. This is why she became a lawyer, and this is what she understands her job to be. But she is also very naive. She's green. She's a rookie. So while she has this belief in the justice system, she doesn't understand that there is a very big difference between law and justice as she imagines it to be, and the reality. And the other protagonist is her client. So Wilbus Bessy Malenga is a queer teenager who, as you mentioned, been imprisoned for crimes against the order of nature, which is the Zambian Penal Code criminalizing same-sex relations. And they meet only once in the prison during an interview. And she really sees herself in this character. She sees in her client, she sees his vulnerability. She sees the trauma, and she also sees herself as his protector and defender. And because at that time in the late 80s, early 90s, same-sex relations were criminalized, that was the law then and is still the law today. And so the case is a bit of a convoluted one because she knows that she can't ultimately bring a standard case because there is no, Bessy has disappeared, there is no body, the police are saying Bessy has been released, and so it wouldn't be a conventional case, but she ingeniously finds another way to use the justice system to try to find, to try to get justice. How does she learn about the system? How does she become sophisticated enough to find creative ways in which she can still bring a case when a conventional case is closed to her?
Thanks for that, Iris. Thanks for really interesting description of the nuances of it. And it is convoluted, but obviously that's the thrilling aspect of it. The one thing for me is, and sorry to go in on specifics quite early doors, but you read the opening to the novel, and the first thing that really struck me is the sort of decrepit nature of the kind of buildings and the public
Yes.
institutions. And then we're in the police station, and you describe it. It's a once grand building gone to seed. Now, whatever this novel is about, whatever it sort of represents, and the fact that it is sort of set within 1990, 30 years ago, I can't help but think there's a sort of lack of faith here about modern institutions and their ability to protect their citizens. Would that be fair?
I think there's potential to go both ways. And what I wanted to capture is, and at least for myself, as I was coming out of law school, I was very naive. And I believed that the institutions, by definition, because that's what you learn, right? Why do they exist if not to protect the vulnerable? And it is through sometimes bitter experience that you come to understand that it's not inevitable, that these institutions can be hijacked. It can be used as tools or instruments of the rich and powerful. And I think we see this play out again and again to different levels of extremity. And I think even in the US, speaking of the election, we had seen and we had assumed that there was a robustness in the institutions, in the separation of state, church, judiciary, legislative systems. But you also see where you have a leader who does not respect the norms, there is a lot of opportunity to test, and these institutions can be found wanting. And actually, there is a lot of fragility, as evidently in the global south, in the global north, as you do in the global south. But in the global south, it becomes very clear where these institutions are fragile, where they're not strong. They are undermined. I mean, it's not some sort of accident that they have lost ground over time, but they are not very strong. And so it becomes easy for dictatorial or authoritarian leaders to use them, co-opt them, and make them part of their executive power. And so you don't really have any kind of checks and balances in the system. And that has consequences for everybody, but particularly the vulnerable. If you have means, you can find other ways to protect yourself. If you don't, then you are really left to the powers that be. And if you are vulnerable, you can be in trouble. I think the other theme that's in there is the legacy of colonialism. This law that we've been talking about, and that's very central to the novel, is a colonial law that was continued through independence and has continued up to now. We're talking about Zambia just had its 60th independence anniversary. So 60 years on, we are still dealing with the legacy. And many of these grand buildings were actually built during colonial times and have continued to be used, but not very well maintained. So these are some of the things that I was thinking about and wanted to capture, either symbolically or sometimes very directly in the novel.
Can I ask that so just go back a little bit then. So you yourself, you were a lawyer, and you sort of recognize some of Grace in yourself. And it's not, my question is not, is this, autobiographical or anything, but just some of the things you've spoken about there. What was that experience like then when you kind of saw the system for what it was? At what stage did you learn that?
You learn in little ways, and I think it's sexism that you faced, sexual harassment. And I think when you're just beginning, you don't understand that these are systems. You think it's an individual. Okay, this person is a jerk, or that person, but then there are no consequences. And then you realize, actually, it's like peeling this onion. You're like, wow, there is a whole system behind the male. And in the story, it is the police officer. He's not a high-ranking police officer, but he acts with impunity, not just authority, but impunity, because he understands that there are going to be no consequences for him, essentially initially harassing, but ultimately being quite violent with both Grace and her client. But he acts with impunity. And that is indicative of a reality where a system is behind this. And so, similar to Grace, as I was maturing in my own professional life, I started to understand in different ways that actually there are lots of systems behind, whether it's racial discrimination or sexism or sexual harassment or any form of discrimination, there are structures behind supporting and allowing and enabling this to happen. And so understanding that kind of came slowly. I wouldn't say I had one aha moment where I was like, oh my goodness, I'm in Matrix, right? It wasn't anything like that, but it was more as I've grown and matured and spent more and more time in different types of systems. So, starting my career in the Zambian sort of legal system, it was more about sexism because I am part of the majority. But moving to the US, then you realize, wow, there's sexism and there's racism and there's anti-discrimination and there's discrimination against immigrants. And all of these have systems behind them, as I said, and they conspire to keep people of color, women, anybody vulnerable, poor people, anyone vulnerable, all minorities, including the LGBTQ plus community, down.
So where does the novel then sit within that? Obviously, you've got all these experiences sort of within law, but how does the novel sort of contribute to that journey then? Why did you write this novel and why now?
It sounds bonkers, but really you kind of start to know for yourself which ones of these stories have to be told. So you just want to tell the story that you want to tell. And it's a bit of a leap of faith that you will get published, but that's not why you write the story. You write the story because you feel very compelled to do this, to tell this story. I think it's a story that few people have told before. And it's really about, what does a defender of human rights look like? For her, she needs to defend everyone. If she's not doing that, she's not doing her job. That's how she sees the world and that's how she understands it. And this is just what motivates her and what makes her special as a human being. And I'm really lucky in my life because I work in gender equality and I do meet these incredible gender champions. And I use the word gender not to mean women, but gender champions all around the world. And these are not people of privilege or people of means, but people who are just true believers. They are going to do the right thing, whether or not the Gates Foundation or any other foundation ultimately finds them and supports them with resources. It is in their core, in their bones, in their very being. They are going to do it until their last breath. And that is the type of person that Grace is. And I wanted to capture that. Grace will find a way. She will keep thinking about it and keep trying to figure out how to make it work, how to make justice work, how to find justice for Bessy, but ultimately for everybody, including herself.
Yeah, that's really interesting because she's absolutely obsessed by this case. She can't sleep. She can't stop thinking about it. It takes her into some dangerous situations. She experiences violence to herself. Does this become problematic? Where's the line then for Grace? Is that the way that she has to be, or is this the way that she's choosing to be?
I think it's the way she is. I think it's part of her DNA, but I think it's combined with being very young, very naive, and having to learn as she goes through this journey, but just also a life journey. When you come out of school in particular, and I really wanted to capture that in Grace. She is such a true believer. And this is actually how education works, and particularly law school, because you're not learning necessarily about the judicial system or how legal systems fail. You are learning about how and when legal systems work. And when you're doing case law, nobody's talking about, the decrepit buildings or, the death by 1,000 paper cuts. No one's talking about that when you're reading case law. And so when you graduate and you get out into the system, it's a rude awakening to understand that, wow, systems don't just work magically. People have to make the systems work. And sometimes it's the incentive structure, and sometimes you have deep-rooted corruption that undermine the system. And she is like that. I believe very much that is what makes her tick. That is what has been successful for her. She had had to fight mightily for herself to get to law school. She's from a poor background, a rural background. She's from Nyampande village, which is a tiny place in the eastern part of Zambia. Most Zambians couldn't put it on the map, much less outside of Zambia.
So Grace then obviously has got lots of determination. There's kind of an element of sort of obsession here to some extent. The novel is very much tied to Grace's perspective, and you really do follow her journey, and you do go back in time to where she grew up in the village. I get for the other people in the novel, then, and you introduce to kind of a huge array of people. What agency do they have in relation to these kind of what is seemingly, in the way you seem to be describing it, overwhelmingly dictatorial systems? What agency do the other people have, or what kind of consciousness do they have to sort of do what Grace is doing? Do they have that same agency, or obviously not in the novel, but perhaps some of these people you've met as well? What choices do they have?
Yeah, and there's a cast of characters around Grace, and some are allies and champions and supporters, and some are sort of emblematic of the systemic problems that she's facing. And I'll give you one example, which is Father Sebastian. So he is a Catholic priest. He has helped Grace a lot, and they are friends. They are close, but they end up butting heads in lots of different ways and places, because he is very emblematic. He's a priest of the Catholic Church, ultimately will go along with what the church dictates. I mean, that's essentially his job, right? He's a priest. So, and there's no flexibility in that. And I think that is also part of the problem. So you have this character who essentially is not a bad person. He is fundamentally quite a good person, but he has this very strong belief in the church. And Grace is a much more independent thinker. She is deeply religious as well, but she challenges many ideas. And one of them is, obviously around the position that the church had taken then, even more strongly, but still is the case now, around the LGBTQ community. And she disagrees with that really fundamentally. She's like, well, how can you hold that position? And, in her discussion with Father Sebastian, she's like, you fought against apartheid. You said apartheid was wrong. You were part of the independence struggle of Zambia. You said racism is wrong. So how can you, in one breath, condemn that kind of discrimination, yet perpetuate another? And again, also she interrogates him and herself around religious beliefs and blind faith. And for her, she's also grown up in a society which believes in the spiritual world, non-religious spiritual world, ancestors, things like witchcraft. I mean, people grow up with all of this, and she doesn't see it as irreconcilable, though Father Sebastian certainly does. So she has a logic to her. She really kind of sees things in a black and white way and says, look, Father Sebastian, either you believe in this or you don't, but you can't tell me what to believe in and what not to believe in when I know this, I've seen this, I've experienced this in my own life, my own lived experience. And actually for her, believing in Catholicism and believing in religion is the bigger stretch, as opposed to the other way around, because she's grown up with all of these beliefs. She's seen it. I mean, she has experienced it herself. She is in communication with the ancestors herself. So I thought that was just an interesting thing to explore. And that is a reality for lots of folks, not just in Zambia, but in many countries, where you have, again, these religious beliefs that come later in history, but that doesn't necessarily erase our own sort of historical spiritual beliefs.
We're going to have a quick break on the Rippling Pages, but do come back. We're going to talk more about this thrilling book, The Lion's Den. We'll be talking with Iris about that. So we'll see you soon. Hey there, just a quick message from me, Liam. If you're enjoying today's show, let me know by leaving a review. I love to hear from you. It's great to know what you love about the show, perhaps what you'd like to see more of too. And also, did you know that you can ask Siri to play the Rippling Pages podcast for you? Just say, hey Siri, please play the Rippling Pages podcast. And the latest episode will come straight up onto your podcast feed. Right, let's get back into it. Let's get back to The Lion's Den.
Lovely tropical fruits and everything grows. It's easy to grow almost anything. And my parents have a little garden in the back, and so it's nice to go like
Amazing.
looking for mangoes in the morning.
Well, welcome back to the Ripping Pages. Yeah, we are talking about it's 30 degrees in Zambia. I am in, it's about 10 degrees in Leeds. It's very grey. Very grey
I'm going to
morning.
stop complaining about the heat.
No, don't worry about that. Okay, brilliant. Well, let's get back into it. And yeah, it's really interesting that you picked out Father Sebastian, and there's a moment where, well, several moments where sort of Grace and him sort of go at it a little bit, don't they? And there's a quote from Father Sebastian that I'm reminded of, and he talks about, think of Jesus forgiving his murderers as he was being crucified. He showed us that anything can be forgiven, and this kind of made me think about the kind of role of guilt in the novel and forgiveness. What kind of role does guilt play in this novel? Who's guilty of some of the acts that have occurred in the novel?
I mean, I think there's guilt that we feel or the characters feel, and guilt that they should feel but don't. And I think there's a lot to answer for. And some of the characters will own it and others do not. And I think for Father Sebastian, I mean, he's talking about forgiveness. He wants Grace to forgive her mother because her mother wanted her to get married very young and stay in the village and marry a older man, a chief who had money and essentially could guarantee them a good life quickly, versus this pipe dream that she had and this life that she was imagining for herself. Her mother just was very dismissive of that and her abilities. And so I think that it is a question that is, it's a theme, but it's not, I think each of the characters would have to grapple with it and is grappling with it off the page. And I think it's for the reader to try to understand which characters will feel guilty, should feel guilty. But I think the Father Sebastian is essentially trying to make Grace feel guilty for her decision to not forgive her mother.
Yeah, and, forgive me for taking it slightly out of context, but it just made me think about some of those things and how you sort of came to the end there. It's not, there's a lot of grey areas, isn't there, I think, and that's what your kind of novel throws up. There are lots of grey areas in some of these debates that we have, and it's not just as easy as going, right, we're in this camp or in that camp.
And, I do have strong opinions, but I do think that is important to consider context and understand how people can come to a different conclusion than you. And I think until you've sort of put yourself firmly in that place, I just want to bring a bit more nuance and understandings to some of these practices that I think all of us can agree should be in the history books, should never have happened, but unfortunately are still practices that happen today. And I would have loved that this book would be a historical novel and people would be like, wow, that happened. I can't believe that happened in 1990. But unfortunately, these themes are recurring and keep recurring. And I think we need to embrace that, understand that, and find better ways, I think, to be more successful.
Yeah, as sort of today might show history repeats, doesn't it? I think sometimes. I mean, I don't know. It depends what your outlook is, but there's a lot of positivity in the novel. There are lessons, but there's positivity too, and
I think that's a really important one because I know I really want to communicate that ultimately it is a thriller and it is a page turner. I wanted it to be about important issues and be thoroughly entertaining and grip a reader from beginning to end. So I don't know if I've achieved those dual goals, but that was my hope and that was my intention, that someone would pick up the book and be able to enjoy it. But once they close it, say, oh, wow, let me think about this issue. Or what do I think about that issue? Or, that character. Not sure I agree, including Grace. She's far from perfect, but she's I think, a very lovable, and ultimately, my hope is that anyone picking up the book can identify strongly with her. If I've done my job well, it means that anyone reading can relate to her, even though she probably has a completely different background and life experience.
The reason I spoke about this idea of guilt, and where do we place it? And it's because for me, Bessy has this presence in the novel because obviously the case is about Bessy,
Yes.
but we don't see a lot of him or them. We don't see a lot of Bessy, despite. And I wonder if some of the reasons that you've just sort of spoken about that. I wonder if that's why that is the case. We don't really get to know Bessy, and that's kind of a little underlying sort of tragedy, I think, beyond the tragedy of the case and everything. But the sort of underlying tragedy is that we don't get to know people like Bessy in these kinds of societies.
Yeah, I mean, Bessy disappears early, basically, very early in the story. And so it really is. And I mean, part of it is I'm not the best qualified. There are others out there who are writing about LGBTQ plus characters, and they can do it with deep knowledge, experience, authenticity, and authority. I can write about grace with all those things, and also what it means to be a champion, an ally, a defender, a protector. And I feel really strongly that I don't have to only defend Black women because I'm a Black woman. And I feel that this is how the systems perpetuate. It's almost a divide and conquer approach. We see Bessy through the eyes of Grace, and then also through the eyes of Bessy's family. And so I think, and I thought about it quite a lot as I was writing the story, the context, and I think even in modern day Zambia, but Zambia is deeply homophobic. And so it's really, really hard to have conversations, has to continue to be extremely careful. And many folks are not going to, they're not going to be out. They're going to try and live very quietly. And the ones that are have faced dire consequences. And this is one of the reasons why I wanted to write the book, because I think we need to start having conversations. We need to really start changing things. I feel like there is a strong minority that is making decisions for everybody to the point of squashing the conversation. And this is real. I have struggled to market my book in Zambia. I have had a book club that was very excited because they were like a Zambian author and they support all Zambian authors, and they usually have big splashy events, and they had gotten in touch with me on a separate trip to say, oh, we heard you're coming to Zambia. We're really excited about having you as a guest. And then when I got here, had a meeting with one of the leads, and she's like, I'm so sorry. I'm so embarrassed, but we cannot host you. I'm like, what do you mean? You are a book club, And she said, well, people are afraid. People are afraid that people work in government or work in NGOs or work in conservative spaces, and they are afraid that if they are seen to be endorsing this book, that they would face consequences, which was surprising to me. I could understand if it was sort of more officially a government structure or a government agency, but for even a book club, and this just shows you the chilling effect is complete, utter and complete. So much so that a book club would not want to host my book and have dubbed it controversial. I'm like, I don't think this book is controversial at all. But this is the society, and this is where people are now, gives me even more determination to get the book out there and to have the conversation and to support other members of this community who are not able to do so. I feel like I'm in quite a privileged position.
As we come to the end, then I just the novel ends with this. Well, it doesn't end, but near the end is this court scene, and it kind of, for a moment, it kind of distills the sort of time to some extent, because we've sort of been over, we followed Grace through this case, we've gone back into her early life, but then there's a few, there's a section of this book that really kind of slows down time, and we're in the courtroom. discussing Wilber's case. I just wondered what that experience was like writing that particular. We see a lot of depictions of, courtrooms in cinema and TV. What was it like doing it in this novel?
Well, I wanted it to be real. So to capture what it really feels like. I think, when it's dramatized, it feels very exciting, and justice is 2 minutes away, and there's a clever lawyer usually who makes the case, and then you kind of has you hanging, and then the decision is rendered. And I wanted it to be brought back a little bit into the reality of what the justice system really is like. And the court is hot, it's uncomfortable. She is in her gown, she's wearing her wig, and it's like itchy and scratchy, but also how legal arguments are actually made. It's not like the gotcha in the movie. It is really down to what does the statute say, but also do it in a way that wasn't boring. But those legal arguments, and the case, for example, that Grace refers to, the Indian case as precedent, that's a real case. So I really wanted to bring some of the reality. It is pretty dramatic. I think it's pretty interesting and exciting for her, because this is her first time in the court. She doesn't quite know what to do. I mean, she knows the law, but how does that play out in the courtroom with all these people, and her excitement and anxiety and concern and worry, and what does that all feel like, juxtaposed the discomfort of being in a black robe in the tropics, in the heat, with a wig, dripping with sweat, and nervous. When the moment comes and she stands up before the court, she becomes very calm. And then it comes almost like she comes into her own. This is going to be her home for the rest of her life. She's going to be a lawyer who is going to be fighting for justice in this court, in these difficult situations.
Maybe just to ask, what's next for you, Iris? Now that the Lion's Den's out there, you've obviously got lots of other stuff going on, but what's next for you, do you think, particularly in literature?
Well, I'm working on 2 new books, but one is sort of meeting Grace later in life, and sort of seeing how she's evolved, developed, what she's learned, how she's grown and changed. And the second book is contemporary, sort of set against the backdrop of Black Lives Matter in the US, and again is going to be centered around a legal case. I'll be able to come back. Hopefully I'll be invited back to be able to talk more about at least one of the books, and hopefully not in
Sure.
in a few less years, let's put it that way.
The world needs more people like Grace, that's for sure. And it looks like that going forward, we're going to need a few more Graces as well. Of course, you're welcome back. But for now, at least, the Lion's Den. You can meet Grace Zulu. You can meet some of the fantastic characters, and the case of Wilber's Bessy Melinda. Iris and Mwanza's The Lion's Den is published by Canongate, and it's out now. But for us, for today, I'd like to thank you for joining me on the podcast, Iris. It's been a wonderful chat, and in the kind of circumstances of what is going on in the world, it's given me some hope for sure. But it has been my pleasure. Thank you for joining me.